It's my absolute joy to welcome Sally and to chair this session. So Sally is an independent researcher who recently completed her PhD with us, fabulous news, and used to work in FE and is now an independent researcher. But Sally will be talking about mature students' unpaid care work as a form of work-based learning. This is a group that is really not talked about anywhere near as much as they should be. So I'm really looking forward to this. So welcome, everybody, and thanks very much, Sally.
Thank you. Shall I start to share?
Yes, please. The floor.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I can see that. It's not full screen
Is that
yet.
okay?
Yep, there we go. All good.
All right. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to listen to me talk about my research. And I'd also really like to thank the Education Research Department at Lancaster for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research and also, you know, helping me with my research as well. So what I'm going to talk about today, the kind of overview of what I'm going to chat about is I'm going to talk about the idea behind my research. I'm just going to talk about one element of the thesis. I'm not going to talk about the entire thing. We haven't got hours and hours and hours. I'm going to talk about the research design in brief and the data analysis method that I used, which is called the listening guide, which some people might be familiar with and might be new to some people. I'm going to talk a bit about Patricia Gouthro and her theory of the home place and lifelong learning. She was the theorist who I used to make sense of my data and help me to structure my findings. I'll talk about some of the main findings in respect to this one aspect of the research, and then I'll talk about the conclusion. So really, I suppose I'm talking about the why I did the research project, how I did the research project and how I understood it, what I found out, and that so what question, you know, why does it matter, or why do I think it matters? So the background to the research, sorry, I'll just keep an eye on the time as well. The background to my research was that I used to work in higher education and further education. Further education colleges in the UK are vocational institutions, and they teach a range of students from the ages of 14 right up to people in their 50s, 60s and 70s. And they also teach a range of different types of qualifications, not just vocational qualifications, mainly from level 1, from 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds doing level 1, all the way up to master's degrees, which some people might not be aware take place in further education colleges. My interest is in mature students, and my work was with higher education mature students in an FE college. It's worth noting that 14% of all mature students in the UK do their higher education, their degrees in further education colleges. But these degrees are vocational. And when I say vocational, I'm not talking really about high status vocational higher education, such as medicine or law or dentistry. We don't tend to apply the label vocational higher education to those kinds of, well, middle class degrees. I'm really talking about degrees which are health and social care, education, other things like that. And in HE and FE, work readiness and employability are emphasised. They almost have a hegemonic sort of status within further education. When I was working in HE and FE, one of the things that always troubled me really was the valorisation, I suppose, of paid work over unpaid care work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. So when I was teaching and students were coming up to assessment, the college that I worked in had quite a rigid mitigation policy. If a student couldn't meet an assessment deadline because they had an increase in their workload, all that they needed to do to prove this was to give the, you know, send the lecturer, send me an email saying that, you know, Ofsted had arrived and therefore they couldn't complete it. However, something like childcare, if there was a breakdown in their childcare arrangements, that was specifically excluded from their mitigation claims. They weren't allowed to claim mitigation for that. If they looked after their mum or their dad, and their mum or their dad had a fall, and that student was then waiting overnight for the ambulance to come, hard cheese. They couldn't get mitigation for that because they couldn't prove that. Or if they were up all night with a child with chickenpox, for example, which would stop them from being able to do their assessment, they couldn't claim mitigation for that. So there was a hierarchy, and paid work was seen as productive and important, and unpaid care work was seen as less so. And I experienced a similar sort of thing myself when I was doing my master's degree with the Open University in my 40s. I did an applied linguistics master's degree. Throughout my degree, I was encouraged to use classroom observations of students, my knowledge of students, how students' second languages would affect their learning of English and so on. But when I proposed to my tutor that I do a study of my son and his homework practices, because I was interested in school literacy, I was strongly discouraged from using my knowledge from my family life, whereas my professional knowledge was, you know, was pushed, I suppose, on the masters. I did the assignment anyway, and I got quite a low mark, but anyway, there we go. In the past, in the 1970s, lifelong learning, anything over the age of 60, you know, any learning taking place over the age of 16 in UK settings, had a very holistic societal sort of emphasis. But over time, that's become much more narrow, and lifelong learning is now seen really as skills acquisition and this sort of meritocratic idea that if you get a degree, you can get a better job, and so on and so forth. So that kind of holistic emphasis has really been missed. So one of my thesis sub-questions was, how does the learning of mature students in their homes actually interact with their care work at home? And does their care work provide them with any learning? I just briefly want to talk a little bit about foundation degrees as an example of what I'm talking about. 2/3 of my 15 participants had either done a foundation degree and moved on to a top-up degree, or they were engaged in doing a foundation degree. Foundation degrees were introduced in the UK in 2001, and they were a means for people with vocational experience to get into the higher education world. They're 2/3 of a bachelor's degree, so they're at level 4 and level 5, and they all have a route, a top-up route, in their validation, which shows how the student can then go on to a BA or a BSc, perhaps at a different institution. Now, these foundation degrees, which are so important, I think, 63% of them are taught in further education colleges in England. There's a really strong emphasis from the QAA on collaboration with local employers, trying to provide the skills that the local economy wants. So this economic focus really shines through in foundation degrees, and all foundation degrees contain a work-based learning component, which can either be done as a voluntary component, or some students do it as part of their work, part of their paid work. They're feminized degrees as well. 66% of them in 2020 were given to women, or were awarded, not given, to women working in pink collar or female coded occupations, i.e. health and social care, beauty therapy, education, childcare. I might have missed some out. So I think these really exemplify what I'm talking about the difference in hierarchical status really of paid work and care work. As way back in 1993, Rosalind Edwards published a very seminal study on mature women and their care work. It was really sort of one of the first pieces of work in this sort of area, or an important piece of work. And she found that many mature students, many of the mature women that she interviewed, didn't think that their private experiences were appropriate for HE learning. And this was something that I bumped up against myself in my research. So I'll move on to talk about how I did it. So I had 15 volunteers. They were all from further education colleges in the northeast of England, from 3 different further education colleges in northeast England. And their ages were from 25 to 53. The definition of a mature student in the UK is somebody who's over the age of 21. And for a postgrad, that's over the age of 25. All my volunteers were on undergraduate degrees, and they were from a range of degree types and a range of subjects, but bar one, all of them could be described as on care-related degrees, really. Education, young people and childcare, health and social care, sports rehabilitation and therapy, and one participant was on an IT degree. That wasn't deliberate on my part. It was just, I suppose it just kind of just to a certain extent reflects the kinds of degrees that were taking place in these northeast further education colleges. So of the 15, 10 of them also combined their study with full-time paid work. 9 of them were parents, but they didn't all necessarily live with their children. One of them, the eldest participant, she cared for her mum and lived with her mum during the lockdown. She was also married as well, so she separated from her husband whilst that happened. 4 of them lived alone, 5 of them were men, 10 of them were women, 4 of them identified as LGBTQI+, 11 of them identified as straight. And what I did was I did life history interviews. I felt it was really important to understand what it was that had led these participants into higher education and further education as a mature student, because when I had been teaching mature students, they'd often given me to understand that it was early experiences of work, or that nobody in their family had gone to university before, so it just wasn't in their family habitus, I suppose, that people went on to higher education, or that they felt that they'd been labelled as thick or stupid. Those were words that came up quite a lot at school. And that higher education really wasn't a place for them. So I was interested in what had led them to that position. So I did life history interviews. When I planned the study, I thought that I would do those face-to-face, but in fact, I did them between April and June 2021. We weren't strictly in lockdown, but we were coming out of the third lockdown in the UK, in England, I should say, was being eased. So doing online interviews, in a way, it was quite good because it made it more accessible. It meant that more people perhaps could take part and feel safe. There were also drawbacks to doing online interviews. You know, it was a little bit more difficult, I think, to build rapport. But on the whole, I think that methodology worked. And the interviews were semi-structured. So I kind of had a frame of questions that I wanted to cover about family, about work history, about education, about their present work, about how they were managing that with any work that they had to do. Because I thought of work in a holistic sense, not just paid work. I also thought of work as care work that people were undertaking as well. And the interviews were recorded. I did them on Teams. And alongside that, I had a research journal, which I hadn't necessarily intended to be. I just used that, I thought, to support my research, but actually it ended up being a source of data as well. So I've got a nice picture here from Zeal Harris, which she's given me permission to use because I feel that this wonderful painting really demonstrates the theory that I'm going to talk about. So I had long been interested in the feminist theory on the division between the private and the public realms, and who decides what's private and who decides what's public, and to what extent this division between the private world, the feminine domestic world, and the public world of work, which is often more seen as more masculinized, to what extent that benefits certain people and who that benefits. And I have to say, I was very influenced by my reading of Nancy Fraser and some of the other social reproduction feminists. So I was interested in that. Because I felt it was an artificial division, and that the public world of work really does depend on the private world of care, of childcare, elder care, and so on, but it goes unacknowledged, it goes unpaid, and is often classified as non-productive and non-work. So that was my starting point really for my theory. And then it turned out when I was doing my research that we were in the middle of a pandemic. And so this interest in the private space of the home became more acute, because it became a site for care work, as it had always been, a site for some learning, but it became the whole site for learning for these students, because all their learning took place over Teams. And it became the site of their paid work for many of them as well. Not all of them, but for many of them. So I felt like I needed a theory which addressed that. And I became drawn to Patricia Gouthro's theory, because she looked at education, and she looked at the education of women in lifelong learning. Gouthro, like lots of other critical educators, is concerned by the corrosive effect of what she calls the marketplace on education. So she's worried about elements of the market being introduced into the way that education is run. She's worried about and concerned about competition, and she's concerned about the individualism of the marketplace. And her theory says that we mustn't just look at the marketplace, we must also look at the home place. And Gouthro is really interested in the learning of women. She looks at mature women. I was interested in all mature students really, but she was interested in women, and she was interested in, or she is interested, she's still here, she's interested in the way in which home place learning can contribute to views of education. And she does this by looking at looking at people's experiences through three different lenses: the lenses of identity, relationships, and labour. I ended up not using her lens of identity, actually. I didn't feel that she tends to define it through family roles. But that only works, husband, wife, daughter, etc., if you're in one of those sorts of family setups. But quite a lot of people aren't, obviously. And she's also interested in heterosexual women. Well, you know, the world is broader than that. And so maybe it was because of lockdown, or I don't know. Identity just didn't seem a very prominent theme in my data. Maybe people's different types of identities weren't very salient when everything was just taking place in their home. And also I felt that she blurred the idea of identity with relationships. I think identity can sometimes, when it's applied in a feminist sense, I think it can somehow have a tendency to essentialize, you know, women, mothers are like this, women are like mothers, they're more caring. I don't really buy that. So she also talks about relationships, and I felt this was very important, because people's relationships often determine their access to higher education. And last but not least, she talks about their labour. And because she was writing her theory in the early 2000s, there wasn't much paid work was going on at home then. So she's really interested in the labour of caring for people, keeping a home running, and so on and so forth. But that was much broader for me, because I was looking at paid work. And then last but not least, she advocates and argues for critical approaches to learning. And she's very influenced by Habermas, by Freire, by Brookfield. So she argues that the marketplace pushes technical skills and technical knowledge into the lifelong learning sector. But actually what's missing sometimes is the consideration of power, the consideration of social issues and social relations, and how those affect people. So that was really well, it wasn't my starting point, but that was my way in which I decided I was going to look at my data. And I used the listening guide to analyse my data. This is an alternative to thematic analysis, which I'd used in previous projects in part one of my PhD. I don't want to argue that it's a better or a superior way of analysing data. It's different. So I was lucky enough to go to a day at Huddersfield University, organised by the British Sociological Society. And the keynote speaker there was Professor Natasha Mothner, and she was talking about the importance of looking at method and considering methods. Well, it was much more complicated than that. And I was very, very interested in what she talked about. So I transcribed the interviews from Teams in full. And I had thought at the back of my mind I would use the listening guide, but then I chickened out and I decided to use thematic analysis instead. So the first 3 transcripts, I did a thematic analysis, and I used NVivo as well. And well, I just didn't like it. I just didn't feel like it worked. I felt like I'd carefully constructed these life histories with my participants, and then it was like I got a little hammer and just sort of smashed it all up again back into themes. And so that holistic focus, why they'd come into HE, was lost. So I parked the thematic analysis and I went back to the listening guide. And it's a multi-staged way of analysing data, and it involves 4 separate readings, and there are listenings, and there are lots of different sort of variations on the theme. So what I did was, in common with lots of other narrative analysis, I restoried the accounts. So if you like, after I'd finished the transcript, I would write a sort of life history on a side or 2 sides of A4 of that participant. And when I was doing that, I was noting metaphors that they used, recurring language that they used. And I was also annotating the transcript reflexively. So I was annotating my questions, I was annotating my reactions, and starting to note really how my own background and my own political commitments and my own experiences influenced what I noticed in the transcripts. The next stage, which is probably the stage that the listening guide is the most famous for, was I created I poems, or pronoun poems, as one of my listening guide colleagues, Rachel, calls them. This involves taking lines from the transcript where the participant talks about themselves, and I underlined them, and then you remove them from the transcript and you set them out like in a poem. And I didn't do that for all of them. I did that for 10 of the transcripts. As you can imagine, it was really, really time consuming. And in the end, I decided to focus on the participants who had care, care responsibilities, I suppose. The third reading was to look at the way in which the participant talked about themselves in relation to others. And I did that on the computer, and I did it with different colours. So I looked at their relationships with their partners, with other family members, such as children, definitely mums and dads. I looked at their relationships with other mature students and non-mature students on their courses. And another crucial relationship, which came up a lot, was their relationship with their HE and FE tutors. And then last but not least, the 4th reading was to look at structures in society and how, or barriers, call it what you will, that that either enabled or disadvantaged the participants in living a full life. So really, I looked at gender, I looked at age, I looked at sexuality, and I looked at social class. And what I was really interested, I think, is the way in which the participant talked about that, whether the participant thought that those structures existed. You know, one of the participants didn't think that gender was a thing at all. He just didn't accept it. So did they think that those things were important, or did they not think that they were important, and why? Patricia Gouthro doesn't really write about social class, but you know, having worked in FE for a very, very long time, I knew that my participants would be interested in social class, and I knew that it would be part of their life histories, and it was. I came up with lots of sort of questions, I think, when I was thinking about how to present the findings in my thesis, and also in articles as well, how to do this. And I have to say, when I was writing my thesis, the chapters on the findings and discussion were the chapters that I found, I really did find were the worst to write. That was the point at which I really felt like quitting, actually, until I found a way of doing it. So lots of questions. one of the things was that all these different multiple readings that I did meant that I started to see types of stories, typologies of stories. But then I had to come to a decision about which stories should I include? Because there were other really important stories as well, like use of alcohol, like disability, like teenage rebellion. What matters? So in the end, I used the research questions to structure the findings chapters. I also then noticed that some of the stories were kind of outliers. They didn't really fit these typologies that I'd built up. And what did I do with those? And the temptation, I think, was to just try and ignore them because they didn't fit. But I was also influenced by Frank, and who says that certain ones need call out as needing to be talked about. And there was one story in particular from a participant called Kim, which I'm going to talk about very briefly at the end, because she was an outlier. Her story was an outlying one, but it was a really important one, and it led to a breakthrough in my thinking. I think the I poems, what would I do with the I poems? Would I put them in an appendix? Would I not put them in at all? In the end, I decided that I would include extracts of the I poems, and I've included extracts of them in this talk as well, because I thought that it brought the reader into a different sort of relationship with the data compared to just transcript extracts. And I thought also it enabled the reader to see what I could see, that the participants could talk about themselves in different voices. I think one of the problems with doing that, though, is it can lead the reader into thinking that the subject of the verbs, the I, is somehow directing the action and, is very agentive. Sometimes that is the case, but it's not always the case. And for that reason, I really did try and focus on language and metaphor, partly because that's my background, I think, and I'm interested in that. And as I said before, I had an applied linguistics degree. Yeah, but again, that was a very subjective process. And then last but not least, this subjectivity, to try and counter some of this subjectivity, I wanted transparency, I wanted validity. So should I or should I not include some of my journal extracts? And in the end, I decided that I would. But that was quite uncomfortable as well, because the journal extracts weren't neat and tidy, they were messy. When I look back at it, it's like a journal of pain, really. I always never felt that I knew what I was doing. I always felt uncomfortable. I always felt like I might be doing it wrong. But nonetheless, I included some of those because I felt it was important to try and be upfront about my own commitments and my own subjectivity and how that influenced my reading of the data and my presentation of the data. So I'll move on to the what I found out, the findings. So it was very obvious that the care work threatened the carefully constructed autonomy that some of these learners had built up prior to lockdown, because all of them, bar one participant, had started their degrees before the first lockdown. So I only really found this in the women carers transcripts. It was the work of being a mum, being a daughter, or being a grandma. So you can see Liz's transcript there. I'll not read it out, but you can see from Liz's transcript extract that she felt that she was doing everything in the house and her husband was doing very little. And this came up, this was one of the stories that came up quite a lot amongst the women learners. Another researcher who was researching COVID and learning and COVID in lockdowns said that, although there was the opportunity for a rethink about gendered roles in lockdown, actually what tended to happen was a sort of back to the 1950s division of labour. And this certainly seemed to be borne out by my findings. But why? Why did these people who had all this different stuff going on, they had their paid work, Liz worked full time as well, they had their paid work, they had their care work, they had their study work. Why did they feel that they were the ones who had to take all of this on? Why was it not shared more equally? And I think one reason for this might be a sort of taken for granted discourse or a cultural script, really, which came out very strongly in my data. And this was the trope, if you like, of the proper mam. So you can see from Sue's transcripts, and Sue wasn't the only person who talked about having a proper mum. She talks about her mum's work. Her mum had, Sue is one of 5. Her mum had 5 children, but it's her dad that laboured. It's her dad that grafted. It's the dad that worked really, really hard. So she's probably, without even thinking about it, I suppose, kind of seeing her mum's work as non-work and her dad's work as productive work. And this came out with other transcripts as well. Luke, one of the participants, talked about, I asked him something about one of his sisters, and he said she was a chemistry teacher, but he said she doesn't out now, she's just a mum. So this idea that working as a mother wasn't important work and wasn't productive work was pretty pervasive in the scripts, and I think led to another form of work which also threatened the students' learning. So 5 of the women were doing homeschooling at the time that I was collecting my data, and it had a massive impact on their learning. So it was found this was the case consistently across Europe, and even in countries which are known for, you know, high levels of gender equality, like Iceland, like Germany, like Canada. Women were doing far more, you know, women were doing far more homeschooling than men. The 22.5 hours is talking about women, the 12 hours is talking about men. These are averages, obviously. So this meant that the triple shift of paid work, study, and care work, there was a 4th dimension added to it, i.e. homeschooling. So the 5 women who talked about this really emphasised the fact that it made them feel very isolated. It was very disruptive to their own learning because they were often being interrupted by their children asking them questions. 2 of the participants were sharing a laptop with their children, so it was really hard for them to study during the day and attend online seminars when their children also needed the laptop. And all of these 5 women all talked about the fact that they considered packing in their degree because they just felt like they couldn't sustain it. It was just untenable. But again, there was this expectation that they should prioritise care for other people over care for themselves and over their studies. Gouthro's theory understands this as an identity question, that the women's central identity is being a mother and that their student identity is a peripheral secondary identity. I don't agree with that. I think it's actually their labour which threatens their HE learning. I don't think it's about their identity not so much as the amount of work that they were expected to do and why they were expected to do so much work. And I think that's where we need to move forward. We need to recognise that this is happening for a lot of caregivers, not just women, but a lot of caregivers. So there's an extract here from Kim's I poem, which I think really illustrates this point. She had been talking about how her brain had been turning on before the pandemic, and then COVID happened. I'll just give you a second to read that. Yeah, I thought that was that really brought me up short, that poem. So this was also complemented, I think, by gendered narratives like the proper mam idea, the full-time proper mam that I talked about before. So both Liz and Kate talked about being strong, independent women. A phrase which is a pet hate of mine, actually. But the problem with the strong, independent woman idea was that when they couldn't manage on all fronts, manage the study, manage the care for their kids, and also manage the homeschooling and also manage their studying, when they couldn't be that strong, independent woman that they felt they were expected to be, they felt like failures and they felt like withdrawing from their degrees. A couple of them even talked about, you know, really having mental health crises. Added to that was this idea, which I think arises from the intensive parenting discourse, which has become more and more prevalent in the Northern Hemisphere, that the children must always come first. You must always prioritise your children. And again, this came up. Sue talked about her grandchild and saying that he had to come first above her study. And Liz talked about this. It came up again and again and again that the kids must come first. But interestingly, I noted that it was only the female parents that talked about this. It wasn't the male parents. And then when I really started to look at the transcripts and I looked at my annotations, I realised that actually I'd asked the question about guilt. I'd asked the women about guilt. And I hadn't asked the men about guilt. And I hadn't even noticed that until I went back and had a look at the transcripts and did this sort of reflexive annotation. And yeah, I was quite troubled by why I had asked the women this question, because to hark back to my master's which I did when I was in the 40s, I have to say, I didn't feel guilty. I've got 2 children, and I didn't feel guilty if my husband had to make the meal, or, you know, if I wasn't there and hovering over them while they were doing their homework, if I needed to get on with a piece of work. So why, if I didn't feel that myself, why had I asked them this? And I think it was partly to do with the prominence of this theme in the literature on mature students, which is very gendered, and which talks about guilt regarding female mature students and doesn't tend to apply the same understanding, I suppose, to mature students who are males experiences. I've used an extract here to illustrate this from Liz's I poem. So you can see that, you can see the despair, really. She says, I don't know what happened. I haven't coped, in all honesty. And, you know, if I could have reached out through the screen and given her a cuddle at that point, I would have liked to, because she couldn't cope, because it wasn't possible to cope. And this juggling metaphor, which comes up again and again and again in lifelong learning sectors and in mature students' literature, I reject it, because it accepts the premise that individuals are responsible for balancing all of these elements. And there was this 4th element in COVID lockdowns as well. It normalizes the idea that it's okay to work really, really long hours, and that it's fine to stay up until midnight, and it's fine to get up at 5:30 in the morning in order to study before the children get up or before you start care for somebody else. And it's an expectation that tends to apply to women mature students. Jill Batmore, writing way before the pandemic was a thing, said that there's a boundarylessness assumed in lifelong learning, a seamlessness between paid work and care work and study work. But it disadvantages mature students who've got care responsibilities, not just women, but it disadvantages them. And what was interesting in the life histories and the accounts of lockdowns that the participants gave me was that boundarylessness was one of the things which led them to feel like withdrawing. But by the time the 2nd and the 3rd lockdowns rolled around, they started to instantiate boundaries themselves, physical boundaries. So having separate desks, putting aside, if they had it, putting aside a room, having one place for their work laptop, a different place for their home laptop. They talked about using their cars more and reading and studying in their cars, because that meant they were away from the family and they were away from paid work. And they also started to refuse homeschooling as well. They started to put down boundaries about how much homeschooling they were prepared to do with their children. Not all of them, but yeah, some of them. So what I think is needed is institutional recognition of care work, and that it contributes to work-based learning. The participants who were on BSc sports therapy and rehabilitation degrees, and all of the participants who were on foundation degrees needed to undertake work placements, but they couldn't in lockdowns. It was physically impossible for them to do them. But Kim says at one point, you know, they've said that, she says that they've said that I haven't done a work placement on level 5, but you know, can I give you how many 1,000 hours of homeschooling I've done? She was on a children and young people's degree. So she felt that that was important learning, and that could have gone forward as a work placement, not instead of necessary, but it could be viewed in a different way. A lot of the participants had adverse adolescent experiences of parental addictions, losing their homes, homophobic bullying, being labelled at school. And a lot of them made links between those experiences and then coming on to these care-related degrees that they were on. And I would like to argue that that knowledge and experience that they brought with them was extremely important on those care-related degrees that they were doing, but it wasn't necessarily counted. Equally, the caring and the fighting, I put that in inverted commas because that was a metaphor which came up again and again and again, these battles that the people who were looking after disabled family members felt that they were undertaking. These things were, there's so much learning that comes with that. There's so many skills that the participants had built up, you know, dealing with authorities, trying to get EHCPs for their, one participant was trying to get an EHCP for her autistic daughter, negotiating with local authorities about transport. You know, all of these kinds of skills and experiences were really important, but went unrecognised on their degrees. So that poses the question, I think, why is workplace experience seen as objective and legitimate for assessment in vocational HE, whilst unpaid care work is not? And I think it comes back to this idea that paid work is productive, paid work is public, therefore that can be used for assessment, but care work, private experiences are not. It's short-sighted, I think, to underestimate the importance of these people's experiences of dealing with family members who've got all of these experiences and not then counting those. So I think we need to think about work-based learning differently. And I think we need to carry forward learning from FE about critical social literacy and the importance of critical social literacy. That's not my phrase, it's a phrase used by Rob Smith and Vicky Duckworth. So I think we need to build critical social literacy. What I found when I was talking to the participants was some really disliked theory, actually. They saw it as irrelevant, they saw it as abstract, they weren't interested when their tutors talked about theory. What they valued was vocational experience, and some of them were very dismissive of university learning as well. Glitz and glamour, one participant called university learning. FE was felt to be more real, more vocational. And I also found when I was talking to the participants that the fact that I wasn't just a researcher, the fact that I was a teacher with a long history of being a teacher, they valued that. They thought that that was important. But the problem with all of that is it can squeeze out critical theory and lead to it being pushed to one side, but actually it's really important because it can help students to understand power relations both in their homes and in their workplaces. So I'll just give you a little example. One of the participants, Kate, worked in a school for children with emotional, social and behavioural difficulties. And Kate was gay and she lived with her female partner. And she was talking to a 15-year-old boy, and she mentioned Mel, that's her partner. I'm using pseudonyms. And the boy said to her, "Who's Mel?" And she said, "Oh, that's my partner." And she talked to him deliberately because the boy was coming out, and she felt that it was a way of educating him, a way of nurturing him. She was then taken to one side. It got back to a member of the senior management team, and she was taken to one side and told categorically that she wasn't supposed to talk about the fact that she was gay. And she felt silenced by that. She didn't know where to go with that. And actually she went and talked to her tutor at the college that she attended. And he really talked to her about theory. He was interested, the tutor was interested, she said, in queer theory. And he talked to her about heteronormative values and family values and so on. And that was transformative for Kate because it helped her sort of see the experience in completely different terms. And helped her throw off some of the shame, I suppose, that she felt was being pushed on her by this member of the senior management team. So I think bringing critical theory back into discussion one of the participants talked about the way in which her tutor had helped her understand some of her experiences of being abused by her husband. That was on her childcare degree. So I think bringing theory back in and instantiating that on vocational HE degrees is important, because I think it can help students understand gender and homophobia and different things where they might have experienced depression or experienced discrimination in the workplace or in their home place. And Nikki talked about the fact that being a mum had helped her, because it helped her to relate it to situations that she'd been through. So when she was looking at theory on safeguarding experiences that she'd had, helped her to understand that. So I think bringing the two things together, not seeing theory as separate, not seeing experience and skills as just things which happen in the workplace, is really important. And then last but not least, I'm going to briefly talk about Kim, the person I talked about being an outlier. When I talked to the students in the interviews, and I put to them that couldn't their experiences of caring be important on their degrees? All of them said no. All of them didn't think that their home place experiences had any relevance to their degrees, with the exception of Kim. And maybe that's because the discourse in FE is so vocationally skills focused. I mean, a couple of them laughed when I asked that, but Kim saw it very differently. So Kim was a student parent. She'd come to the college, and when she'd started at the college, she said she felt embarrassed. She felt like other students would say, what's she doing here? Is she a lecturer? But over time, and with her research, she came to understand that the category of the student parent was an institutional category. It wasn't just Kim, it was an institutional category. And she came at that realization that the barriers that students face in higher education and further education aren't caused by the individual. They're caused by the institution not being set up and not understanding the experience of the student parent. And she talks here about some of her student parent colleagues, really. And she's so empathetic. You know, she talks about them wanting to make a change in their lives, wanting to do something better for their child, making that big step, but then hitting that wall. And because something doesn't work, finance, childcare, whatever it is. And that puts Kim in a different position, in that she decides that she wants to do something for student parents, and she starts to become an advocate for them. And this story was really important for me and my understanding in my research, because I realized that actually the label which a lot of the participants carried into their studies as a mature student was a deficit label, that they weren't the same as the young students. They didn't look the same. They were a failure because they hadn't managed at school, because they'd started a degree earlier and dropped out of it. There were very few positive stories for them to look to about mature students. And I felt that the work that Kim was doing with her, because she got a student fellowship with her college. I felt that the work that she was doing on the category of student parent, advocating for them and trying to promote positive stories of student parents who were succeeding, could be applied in further education colleges to the mature student. So I'm coming to the end. There were some significant limitations to my study. In most narrative analyses, it's recommended that researchers do more than one interview with the participants, but I didn't. I only did one per participant. That was partly an ethical choice, actually, because I felt, seen as my whole shtick about mature students was that they do so much work, and it's so unfair that we expect them to do so much work. I couldn't then very well expect them to keep on doing interviews with me, which were actually really for my benefit rather than for their benefit. So that was the reason that I only did that. I was anxious to avoid this notion that care is women's work and not men's work. So I wanted to recruit as many men as I did women, but I just couldn't. I only got a third of the sample were men. And similarly, I wanted an equal number of part-time and full-time students, but I couldn't recruit them. So these figures of the sample reflect the demographics, really, of higher education and further education. But I felt that was a shame, but never mind. And I could only recruit from colleges in Northeast England. I tried to recruit from a college in Cumbria. I tried to recruit in Kidderminster, in London, but in the end I couldn't. So it's impossible really to know how far some of these findings, like the finding about the proper mam, how far that's a kind of regional finding. Would that apply elsewhere in the country? Would it apply elsewhere in other countries? I don't know. But I came up with some recommendations. I think it's fair to assume that paid working and studying from home are likely to continue. There was an ONS study that came out just last week that said 28% of employees are engaged in hybrid working. So we need to think about the home place, and we need to embed respect for that sort of learning in our HE curricula, I think. I think we should listen to carers in HEI settings, listen to what they've got to say and listen to their experiences, and think about, rather than making assumptions about how we can support them, think about how they say they need support, what sort of support they need. I think we need to think about the way that employability and skills discourses do promote this marketplace view of learning, this competitive, individualistic view of learning. You know, if you push, you can get on, you can do anything. Well, actually, no, you can't. Sometimes there are barriers in your life which mean that you can't just do anything. And those barriers might be care, or they might be other things, age, gender, and so on. I think it's really important that we understand mature students' lives and their holistically, rather than just in the classroom, because there's been a massive drop in the numbers of part-time students in HE in England, 40% between 2010 and 2018, 70% decline in part-time mature students. So I think it's important from that point of view. And last but not least, I'm passionate really about sharing research in more accessible language and trying to share research with the people that it affects. I took part in a podcast, and at the end I hadn't finished the research at that point. At the end of the podcast, the host, who worked in FE herself, said to me, "Well, how are you going to share this?" And I kind of gave her a bit of a fudgy answer. And then she said, no, how are you going to share it with the people that matter? Not just other university, well, I'm not a university lecturer, but not just university lecturers. So I think that's really important, trying to get these messages, these positive messages out to mature students themselves, and doing it in a way that isn't off-putting. I think the tide is starting to turn on unpaid care. I think more notice is being paid to it. The UN have instigated a day of care and support in October. I have to say there was more fuss about it in 2023 when it was inaugurated than this year. There's a new journal about care, Care and Caring, which was developed in 2017, I think. There are more and more counter-narratives being published. You might have come across the Care Collective, or Madeline Bunting's book, Labours of Love, or Kathleen Lynch, Care and Capitalism. And there is more research which is listening to the voices of HE and FE students who often are sort of sidelined in the sector. And I think that's really positive and really good. So I think there's lots and lots of signs of hope and positivity there, but it needs working at as well. And last but not least, thank you very much for listening to the presentation. Hope I haven't gone on too long, and very interested to hear what people think. And I've just put a few references there if they're helpful to anybody who's interested in this area. That's me.
Sally, that was fabulous, and also almost perfect in terms of timekeeping.
Oh, good.
You
Thank
said you
you.
were coming towards the end. We've just got had about 3 minutes before I started sort of flashing warning lights, but no, you do absolutely perfect timing. So thank you so much. Jonathan just put something in the chat just to say thank you so much. And he's added your paper for others to read. So, I mean, you covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
You know, really interesting insights, methodological, theoretical, empirical, lots of cultural recognition, particularly around the barriers, the structural barriers that people face, and also lots of policy implications.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'd like to do now is open the floor. So if you'd like to ask a question and be recorded, and you're happy to be recorded, then please raise a digital hand and I'll try and keep an eye out. Otherwise, if you'd like to ask a question in the chat, I can read it out for you. So
shall I stop sharing my screen, Richard?
yeah, you can do actually, and then maybe we can fill the screen with people. So Kathy on line 2, you're up first.
Thank you, Richard. I'll just lower my hand. That was fantastic, Sally. Thank you so much. And so much of it resonated with me because for my doctoral research, I was in that same position of trying one approach to analysis and it not working, and discovering the listening guide or voice-centered relational method as I would know it, and trying that and thinking, wow, this is such a powerful tool. And the question that I have is about the sort of powerful nature of that approach to analysis, and whether you perhaps had any times when you uncovered things that perhaps the participants hadn't expected you to find, and what you did with those things, whether you were able to sort of check back with your participants. I suspect not, perhaps because you've already said about, you know, being quite conscious that they were time poor anyway. But yeah, I just wondered how you dealt with those unexpected discoveries, the things that maybe your participants might have shared unconsciously that you were only aware of because of the method that you used.
The listening guide. Yeah. I mean, you're right. I wondered whether to that was one of my tortured kind of many-paged issues that I wrote about in my research journal about whether or not to check back with the participants, and I decided, you know, with my analysis, and I decided in the end that I wasn't going to, partly because of the amount of work that would involve, partly because I asked them if they wanted me to share the transcripts with them, and I think 8 of them said they did, but 7 of them didn't even want to see the transcripts. So I thought they're probably not that interested, you know, it's in the past for them. And then also I felt like the analysis method was so involved and so complex, then how would I actually even explain what I poems were with them without having another Zoom interview with them or whatever? So for all of those reasons, I decided not to share it. And last but not least, actually, I thought, even if I do share it, if they say, well, no, I don't agree, am I actually going to change it? And the answer was, truthfully, probably no, I wasn't probably going to change it. So I didn't share them. I think in terms of the unexpected things, the one that really stands out is the one that I just talked about, Kim there, and her different take really on her position compared to the other 14 students. And I can remember thinking, you know, what am I going to do with this? I'll just leave it. I'll just put it to one side, and then thinking, no, you've got to write about this. This is really important. You've got to write about it. The other thing which I think became very clear to me, and maybe wasn't clear to some of the participants, was the extent to which working in FE, again, there were all these gendered assumptions about, one of the participants was a trainer in FE, and she did CPD with staff, and she said that it was often assumed that she came from a hairdressing background, but she didn't. She was from a business background. And again, she kind of said, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I don't know what, she individualized it, thinking that it was her and it must be something that she was doing wrong. And that kind of led me to seeing that thing in lots of different transcripts, this idea that, you know, when they suffered some form of oppression, really, because of their gender or because of their sexuality or because of their nationality, a couple of the students weren't British, they individualized that, but actually it was structural. But I don't know that they necessarily saw that. And I didn't necessarily say that I thought that when I did the interviews. I wasn't really upfront with them about being a feminist. So when one of my participants who didn't really see gender said, I asked him about gender, and he said, well, I was in the army, and, you know, gender wasn't a thing. You know, it was 99% men. We went out, we shot guns, we went out on the lash afterwards. You know, gender wasn't a thing. And I didn't say to him then, maybe in a cowardly way, oh, well, actually, I think it's a very important thing, and I'm a feminist researcher, because of that thing of wanting to create that rapport with the student, with the participant, and not wanting to destroy that. And then afterwards saying, oh, was I complicit? You know, why did I not say anything? So I think the listening guide was really crucial, maybe for you as well, really crucial in uncovering all these little bits that maybe I wouldn't have seen if I had just been looking for themes. But I don't know, because I abandoned the thematic analysis. I think I would have found different things if I'd done a thematic analysis. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the point, also the point you made about struggling with the analysis, it's really important to say for people who aren't at that stage yet that it's really, really common. It's, in a way, it's one of the most difficult parts, is not just doing the analysis, but then working out how to present it and what to keep in, what to cut out. I know it takes a lot longer than you think. You don't just press a button and get to 42, do you? So Carolyn, you had your hand up next.
I did. Thanks, Richard. And thanks, Sally. That was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Really interesting and really lovely presentation style. So thanks.
Thank you.
And just on your comment there, Richard, I mean, I find working out the structure one of the hardest things, you know, which is about what to include, isn't it? But how to structure it. So you just kind of ended on what I think was going to be my question there, Sally, when you were talking about the participant that didn't accept gender. You kind of mentioned it in the presentation, hence me putting my hand up, and then I think you just started to unpack it a bit there. But can you say a bit more about what that meant? Was it just somebody that just didn't see gender as relevant, or just
he just didn't see it as relevant at all? Yeah, he just didn't. To me it was absolutely crucial, because vocational FE, I think, is extremely gendered. And I think it's quite hard to get away from. I'm a feminist researcher, but I think it's quite hard to get away from that understanding. And he just didn't see it as a thing. He just didn't think it was important. At the same time, as he was the same guy who'd said that his sister didn't work. She was just a mum, you know. So he accepted it on one level, but on another level, he really didn't. And I was definitely aware that it was a much bigger thing for me than it was for probably all of the participants, actually, you know, and it was something that I was looking at, and it wasn't necessarily something that they particularly thought about in their everyday life. But yeah, I was a bit astonished when he said it, actually. Wow. And that was, things like that were where the listening guide was really important as well, because in that first reading where you annotate the transcripts, you know, I was really kind of pretty straightforward and honest about it in my annotations. Like, I can remember I wrote something like, couldn't believe it when Luke said this. Why did I not challenge it? Why did I not say anything? Why did I just let it go? And then that was a prompt for my thinking afterwards, thinking, well, why did I do that? Why didn't I say anything else? Was it complicity, or was it actually about this, like I said to Kathy, this maintenance of that research relationship? And I think it probably was the latter, because I'm not usually scared to speak up for my views. Yeah.
Interesting though, if you were to do it again, and I suppose how you would tease out some of these things. I mean, I don't think it's that unusual that sometimes people just don't engage with gender or think it's not an issue or whatever, when it is. So, you know, interesting about how you tease that out.
But it was interesting also, Kate, the participant that I talked about, and her experience at the school, where she felt that she was silenced by the deputy head, and she was really at pains throughout the interview. Hers was a really long interview. It was a 2-hour plus interview, and she was really at pains to emphasize that she was what she called a quiet gay. And she said, although she was very grateful to the people who'd gone on gay pride marches and so on and so forth, that really wasn't her. That really wasn't part of her identity. So then I think it was a horrible shock to her, you know, what she felt. She was working in this middle class environment of a school where she came up against what I suppose was homophobia and heteronormativity, and she didn't, you know, it was like it was a part of her life that she lived, but she didn't necessarily think about it in political terms until she came up against it, and then the tutor did this sort of work with her really afterwards.
Yeah, no, interesting. And then the way that you can kind of tease out the gender narratives as well without people necessarily kind of talking about gender. Or
Yeah.
So that.
Yeah, definitely. And definitely in the world of work, you know, their experiences in workplaces, it definitely came out there as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's also something in there about the invisibility of all of these things, the fact that these things become internalized, right? It's like the presence of whiteness or the presence of
Yeah.
and those kinds of things, and they're just not
Yeah.
seen. It's accepted as normal, and that's half of the. Well, it's a great part of the issue. Paul, you raised a hand, I think.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, fiddling with my buttons. Thanks, Sally. That was brilliant. Really, really evocative. I kind of got two related questions. That I'd be interested in hearing your response to. First of all, there seems to be quite a strong implicit model of what an educational institution should be like in terms of what you're saying, that you seem to be implying quite a strong vision of what that should be, and I'd be interested in kind of you maybe making that a bit more explicit. And kind of, I think, related is, you know, obviously you're making a strong case for unpaid work being recognised as you know, within kind of context work-based learning, and I just, you know, clearly what that does is an implication of that is it kind of demands that everything is made available for education and nothing's private, and you know, and so I'll just be interested in your thoughts on that, and the kind of, you know, suddenly everything coming under the educational gaze.
Yeah, I think that's
and
a really
the downside of that.
Definitely, yeah, good. Thank you. In terms of the educational institution, I suppose what I'm really thinking about is this. I mean, I can't talk about everything. There's just too much. But in terms of the bit that I'm talking about, I think that colleges, higher education institutions need to be modelled more on the idea of what Nancy Fraser calls the universal caregiver. So rather than thinking about, you know, these add-on approaches, we'll add on a nursery, we'll try and start for this class, because this has got a lot of women in, you know, childcare class, we'll start at 9:30, you know, that kind of thing. Sweep all of that away and start from the premise that everybody might be a caregiver. And caregiving isn't just about, you know, well, my parents have passed away now, but caregiving isn't just about looking after children either. Caregiving can be about looking after elderly relatives. It can be about looking after partners. It's not just heterosexual women looking after kids. And so I think that's an important part of the model going forward. And the other part that I think the change that I would like to see really, or the move that I would like to see in FE, is to move away from this idea that work-based learning is just about work-based skills and work-based knowledge, and actually looking at the way in which power operates in the workplace, because the workplace is the place where most of us experience political power on a daily basis. We do. So thinking about these questions of oppression and these questions of social relations in the workplace as part of workplace learning, rather than simply filling in your work-based learning portfolio, which tends to be a very different sort of set of skills. So that's my answer to the first part of your question. The second part of the question about the, you know, the privacy and the public. First of all, you know, I think the division is quite an artificial one between the public and the private, but you can't say that people's private, intimate lives should just be up for grabs and are not off limits. And although I'm sort of going along with that argument that there is a separation between the two, I do recognise, of course, I recognise that there are parts of people's lives that are private and that shouldn't be up for grabs, and that they don't want to put forward for educational issues. But maybe they should be able to, if they want to. Maybe a consideration, if you've been, you know, if you've suffered from domestic abuse, maybe you being able to talk about that in the context of a safeguarding assignment, maybe that's your choice, that you can do that rather than it just being off limits. But you know, the idea of the private domain and privacy are two, I think Iris Young talks about that. They're not the same. They're often seen as the same, but privacy and the private domain are not necessarily the same. But lastly, I think there is a danger, which I think you were hinting at, and I agree, that if you then bring the private domain and people's private experiences of care into those settings, into the HE setting, you're then starting to make judgments about them and assess them, and that runs the risk of saying, you're doing it wrong. You're caring in a working class way, and we don't want you to do it like that. We want you to do it like this. And that comes up in Bev Skegg's book, the 1997 book, where the women that she studied on FE courses, they were really experienced carers, but they didn't do it right because they didn't do it according to the way that they choose. And I think that's a real danger of what I'm advocating. Yeah, you know, as soon as you start to codify it and attach learning outcomes and learning objectives to it, and I haven't got the answer to that, Paul. I haven't. I just think it needs to be thought about, I think, rather than just off limits.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I think that's great. And I think, you know, in a way, what you're talking about, you can talk about it in the way of we need to add non-paid work to our definition of work.
Yes.
But actually, that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is we need to explode our notion of work and actually completely interrogate it in order to know far more clearly what work is. And therefore, we can decide what experiences, you know, it's not just about money, what experiences count. And then, yeah, and then part of that process, as you kind of implied there, is for students to make a kind of informed judgment about which experiences they want to make available under that way of thinking about work. So, and I think that whole, you know, because, you know, there's a lot of stuff, you know, given the state of the planet and the environmental emergency, actually, we might be preparing students for a future of no work in that sense.
Absolutely.
So actually rethinking what work looks like and what it means, you know, which is what you're doing brilliantly in your work, is incredibly important.
I think that question, the what counts, that's the key question, isn't it? What counts and how does it count? But I couldn't use that because Patricia Gouthro used that. So leave it to her. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and also for that response, Sally. My the question that I had, I can't see another hand raised, so kind of chair's prerogative or whatever it's called. Also leading on from that point around the problems around instrumentalizing and putting an employment value on unpaid work, including that as part of our recognition of how all of this works, and as Paul said about thinking about what is or isn't work, and what isn't valued. But is there also some value potentially in kind of unpinning, or to use Paul's term, exploding in a way what's called, can you explain gaps in your CV that you see, for example, in job applications? And my other half had exactly the same thing, returning to work, right? Having stopped work while the kids were little, while I
worked,
stopped work, you know, I recognize that as well. But how there's an expectation that the gap in your CV needs explaining, rather than this is widely accepted. Actually, there's a whole load of really, it's socially important, or, you know, there are lots of important things about this, but also some instrumentally useful things, that it's not wasted time, or it's not irrelevant time in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, and it has implications for women going into HE and foundation degrees, particularly where there are mechanisms which recognise experiences, work experiences, but only certain types of experience are recognised. So with the recognition of prior learning, somebody who doesn't have those gaps in their CV might have quite a lot of experiences that they can bring forward for RPEL, whereas somebody who's taken time to work at home and look after the children, which, as you say, is necessary and socially useful, and everybody benefits from that, not just the family and the children themselves, then that person doesn't have those experiences to take forward for RPEL either. And that person is also disadvantaged in terms of their pension and maybe in terms of their, you know, I'm talking about my own lived experience as well here. You know, you haven't built up the same pension, you've done part-time work because you've been looking after the kids, all of that. Yeah, it's about what's valued, isn't it? It's about what society values. And that's why I think if the tide starts to turn a little bit, you know, these things they work as movements, don't they? People's awarenesses start to change, and hopefully, yeah, it's not very hopeful though when you look at what's happening in, say, the States or, you know, anyway.
Muted. I think that point about value and actually different forms of value are then really important. So yeah, that's really useful. We had a question from Rachel. Sorry, I missed that earlier. She said, apart from thank you, Sally, such amazing research. My question is about yourself as a researcher. Using the listening guide can be an emotive subjective experience. I wonder what you learned about yourself through the process. That is a fabulous question.
I think I know who this is from as well. Yeah, I learned a lot of uncomfortable things about myself when I was using in the listening guide, actually. I learned as a researcher, I was quite keen to build up relationships with participants based on similarities or based on apparent similarities, let's say. So the fact that I had been a mature student, the fact that I had kids, the fact that I'd, you know, got a long vocational history as a teacher. And I was very happy when the participants made those points of contact with me. I was very happy for them to let them run with them, really, because I felt like it helped to build up the relationship. But when I was using the listening guide and when I was annotating the transcripts, I really came to realize that some of those points, those shared points, were actually pretty phony on my part, because yes, I had been a mature student in my 40s, but I'd got a degree when I was in my early, you know, when I was 21. And yes, I've been a mature student with growing up kids, but I'd had quite a decent job alongside that. I wasn't doing this in order necessarily to get on. You know, and I'd been to a grammar school and all this kind of stuff. So actually, some of the points of commonality, which I was quite happy for the students the participants to think about, they weren't necessarily points of commonality. So there was that. There were times which were quite emotional in the interviews as well. One of the participants talked about her partner who had a brain tumor, and my mother had a brain tumor a few years before, and she talked quite a lot about this issue. And yeah, I found it really hard, actually, and I didn't want her to know that I was upset, so I kind of tried to tamp down my feelings. Was that the right thing to do? I don't know. So again, another tortured writing about it in my research journal. So there were quite a lot of things about my political commitments as well, which the listening guide threw up for me. And then there was all the stuff around the creation of the I-poems, what to leave in, what to include, should I title them, should I not title them, loads of questions. Yeah, it was an emotional roller coaster, actually, Rachel, as you know.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, sometimes the uncomfortable truths in many ways that we gain from doing research. Does anyone have any last brief questions? Please raise a hand or put it in the chat. Sally, at some stage, we're going to have to make sure that you get to read through the comments, because so many positive comments.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Fascinating and useful this
Thank
has
you.
been. So we can definitely pull that out afterwards. Is there anything that you'd like to add based on the discussions, or anything that you kind of missed out from your presentation that you think would be that you'd like to raise?
What? No, I don't. No, not really. I am interested in whether, I suppose I'm quite interested in whether people think it's important or whether people think it's, I mean, there were lots of other parts to my thesis. This is just one strand of it, really. Yeah, I suppose I am interested in whether people think that this is important, or whether they think it's a women's issue, because I don't think it's a women's issue. I think it's an everybody's issue. So yeah, I'm interested in that, and I'm pleased that lots of people came to the presentation, because I think it is really important, and a lot of us here are teaching mature students, and if it makes us think a little bit about their responsibilities and their work in different terms, then I'm pleased about that. No, there isn't really anything. I mean, I was going to include a section where I showed how I did the analysis of the I poems, and if anybody wants to talk to me or Rachel Helm about using the listening guide, or Kathy, then I'm sure that we would all be very willing to talk about it, because it's very interesting. It's a very interesting methodology of data analysis. Yeah. But I'm just pleased that so many people came to listen. It's really nice, and pleased that people asked good questions as well.
Yeah, I think it's, in a way, actually, particularly within this group, asking if it's important is almost a rhetorical question, right? But I just wanted to say also thank you so much for presenting really clearly, really accessibly, but also in depth.
Thank you.
There was so much that you covered. It was absolutely fascinating. So thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you particularly, Sally, for sharing your amazing PhD work. I also need to do a few housekeeping things, which is to say that the next online seminar is actually next week, same time, same place. So 27th at 12:30, and is going to be presented by a colleague from Sunway University, talking about preparing leaders for the future, 21st century CPD paradigm. That's to do with high school principals or school principals. So that is another one that is worth attending. So to everyone who came, thank you very much. And also particularly to Sally, congratulations on the completion of your PhD, and also for such an excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you all.